Peace is a wonderful thing. The opportunity to be safe in your home with your relatives, or even be in your room watching this video, is priceless. But it doesn't feel like it. One doesn't know what they have until they lose it. Many have given their lifetimes, or straight up cut them short, with the intention of creating peaceful times, such like mine and most of us. And the regular people who lived in summer of 1914 had peace as well. They enjoyed the company of their loved ones, the music of the time. Football was a big thing back then. I'm saying that like it wasn't an even bigger one now. Until they didn't. A consequence of most of the large nations of the time being allied to either the Franco-British Entente or the Central Powers, and Austro-Hungary having imperial problems with the Balkans. A bit hypocritical to be pissed off with a region that you're trying to conquer for fighting back, but I digress. The first months of the First World War were bloodier than the following years in total. Stupid orders will cost the lives of thousands of well-trained professionals in singular infantry or cavalry charges done by both sides. Soon, numberless, unexperienced conscripts will replace these professionals, mostly young people who had been studying or working in factories, shops, restaurants, whatever. The months of autumn were hellish. The improvised trenches became the home of all these people, living in the mud and the cold, coexisting with rats and maggots, at a higher risk of disease. They will be constantly harassed by the snipers of the opposite trench or by the randomness of artillery strikes, kept awake by the fear of a night raid. The First Battle of Ypres ended without victory, and the race to the sea resulted in a stalemate, creating endless lines of trenches from the Belgian ports and all the way to the Swiss Alps. By December, most of professionals had been wiped out by all sorts of ways to die, and most of the force were regular people, like you and I. Pope Benedict XV had requested both warring sides for an official truce during Christmas. He said, "The guns may fall silent, at least upon the night the angels sang." But all the warring nations refused. Winston Churchill wrote in mid-December that he wondered if one day, suddenly the armies would get pissed off and say, "There has to be another way." The troops of the Western Front received irrational amounts of gifts from the leaders, to the point that they struggled to store them properly. Although many soldiers and officers asked for a truce, high command from either side wouldn't allow it, and some directly prohibited anything related to it. It simply wasn't convenient to have your armies fraternizing with the enemy ones in any way. 2 weeks prior to Christmas, there was a bizarre conversation between a British soldier and a German one in the Western Front. "Good morning, Fritz!" He didn't answer. He will try multiple times until he finally did. "Good morning." "How are ya?" "Alright." "Come over here, Fritz." "No, if I go, I get shot." "No, you won't." "Come on, no fear. Come and get some facts, Fritz." "No, you come halfway and I meet you." "Alright." The madman climbed to no man's land. Fritz did as well. They shook hands as the British gave him the cigarettes, and Fritz gave him German cheese in exchange. The other British soldiers waved their caps and cheered at the bravery of those men. About 18 men from each side greeted their enemies in no man's land. No shots were fired. They were all comrades, if only for a moment. Half an hour later, they all came back to their trenches to heed their orders of shooting at each other again. The rumor of them getting away with something that was forbidden soon spread, making the other troops a bit less afraid to do the same. There were always truces to bury the bodies of the fallen, but throughout fall and winter, many had shown fraternity with the enemy. like ceasing fire to eat at the same time, looking the other way when an enemy made a mistake, and overall showing a lack of hate towards their fellow humans. On the 20th of December, the Champagne offensive started, sending many more men to the afterlife than normal. In the following days, the raining stopped and the snow turned the ground white. Lieutenant Sir Edward Hulse of the Scots Guards, who was in the Franco-Belgian border, started preparing a concert for Christmas Day, cause him and his men were musicians. Both sides put candles on their trenches. The Germans put Christmas trees in their parapets and started singing Christmas carols with German lyrics every night. Lieutenant Hulse sensed a challenge and immediately responded with singing the English lyrics. First, it was just a competition, but it became oddly friendly. In some areas, officers agreed to do an unofficial armistice on Christmas. Some even met in no man's land and shook hands, including Hulse. The Belgians and French were less likely to fraternize, since they were the ones being invaded, the former having lost 95% of their land after fighting being very outnumbered. The British and Germans had things in common. Both were fighting in a strange land, in the same mud and misery, for a cause that was beyond defending their own nation directly, to the point of questioning their motivations for killing the others. The night of the 24th, thousands of men from both sides were either singing or shouting at their enemies in a friendly way. This was possible thanks to the fact that many Germans spoke English, because they had studied or lived in London or other parts of the UK. In Flanders, a German shouted, "English! Tomorrow if you no shoot, we no shoot!" That night, most of these people got the chance of sleeping quietly for once. And so, it was Christmas. Most of the soldiers of the Western Front were Christians, and this day was more than a mere celebration for them. It reminded them of the values of the New Testament, the teachings of Jesus. Fire ceased in most of the front for the first time in 5 months, although not everywhere. When the British woke up that morning, they saw the Germans on their parapets, in full view of them as a sign of trust, motivating them to climb over the top as well. But the dawn also illuminated the bodies of the fallen, so in the first hours they buried them together, grieving for them who didn't have the chance to celebrate Christmas. They then spoke to each other, many shook hands. Some even gave a hug to those who had been their enemies the day before. Mostly British, Germans, and a fair amount of Frenchmen. The British Indian Corps didn't celebrate Christmas, but it reminded them of their own holiday. When offered cigarettes by the Germans, many took part in the truce as well. It wasn't a few dozen men this time, or hundreds. It was 100,000 soldiers who participated in the Christmas Truce. That is the size of a whole field army. The highest concentration of them was in St. Yvon. The Germans offered to do so to the Russians in the Eastern Front, but they celebrate Christmas on a different date, the 7th of January. In the Austro-Hungarian part of the Eastern Front, they did manage to convince the Russians to meet and shake hands. The men in the truces exchanged gifts. Cigarettes, cigars, chocolate, mostly from the overflow of gifts they had received from their leaders. They spoke about their doubts of even fighting at all. They both said that they were fighting for freedom and liberation, which made them question if they were being fed up with lies. They smoked together. Brigadier General Congreve said that one of his captains shared a cigar with the best shot of the German army, who was oddly an 18-year-old. A German lieutenant allowed the humorist Bruce Bairnsfather to cut some of the fancy buttons on his coat with wire clippers, and saw a British machine gunner who used to be a hairdresser giving haircuts to Germans who needed one. Bruce said that he wouldn't have missed that unique and weird day for any fancy meal at home. Lieutenant Halls performed a sing-song together with English, Irish, Prussians and Württembergers, which he described as astounding, and said, "If I had seen it on a cinematograph film, I should have sworn that it was faked." Captain Robert Miles wrote, "We had the most extraordinary Christmas imaginable, an unauthorized but perfectly understood truce. Not a single shot was fired. German accounts described it as incredible, and that they wouldn't have changed it for the most glorious Christmas night at home." A Bavarian corporal opposed the truce and said that such a thing should not happen in wartime. He didn't even attend his unit's Christmas mass. He was a bitter lunatic. Let's say he is the kind of guy who wouldn't be accepted in our school. A fair amount of them weren't able to communicate properly, but football players found a solution to continue the celebration. Many said that a ball came out of nowhere, and others had to resort to playing with food cans. Many played with no clear rules for hours, hundreds of them with the same one, for possibly a total of 29 matches. In 2 rigid matches, the Scots bet the Prussians and Hanovers 4-1, and in another, the Germans bet the British 3-2. The French Gustave Berthier wrote that the Germans made a sign in which they wished to speak to them, that they weren't going to shoot. The Germans met them, saying that they were tired of the war. The French found out that they related to many of them, like having wives and kids at home, and thought they weren't really that different to them after all. On the Asia front, the Germans helped many Belgian soldiers to send letters back to their homes in occupied Belgium, but it eventually came to an end. Some got away with ceasing fire until nearly New Year's Eve. Many others ended at midnight, either by agreement, being told off, or being harassed by artillery. In an instance, some German soldiers stood in their parapets for hours after the truce ended, and the British refused to shoot them. The next day, the trench warfare continued. Many of those who celebrated didn't make it out of the war. Lieutenant Halls lost his life in March of 1915, trying to save his commanding officer, who was wounded. The then Captain Halls was just 25. Him and his temporal friends are way more known and cherished than most of those soldiers who opposed the truce, for being brave enough to create their own peace, if only for a day, with their own hands. Later Christmases didn't have a widespread truce because of the later use of horrible weapons such as air bombardments, toxic gas and flamethrowers. In some cases, a 24-hour artillery barrage was ordered to prevent any form of fraternization. But still, sporadic, unofficial truces continued to happen. The Anzac and Ottomans at Gallipoli had a 9-hour one in March of 1915 to bury the dead, in which they shared cigarettes and smiles with each other. And in Christmas of 1915, Germans and French got away with it in Vosges, meeting through tunnels and exchanging wine, cognac and food. And there was even a big football match. It might have lasted until New Year's Eve. The legacy of the Christmas truces endured. A cross was planted in Saint Yvonne, which in 1999 saw the congregation of many veterans who participated in it. The 2005 French movie Joyeux Noël is a reenactment of the glorious event, and the Swedish band Sabaton made the song Christmas Truce. And overall, the event shows that the kindness of humankind can endure in the most horrible places, like a heaven in the center of a storm. So whoever you are, wherever you are, Merry Christmas! I wish you a wonderful month. The next video will be an episode of the Human Saga. And look, I've got a new avatar. What do you think? That's it. Now you know that 100,000 soldiers decided they didn't want to work for a day because it was a holiday. Ciao!